Hey everybody, this is a section from Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union. It's on Tony Cliff's conception of the USSR. There's other sections that reference people who are in the tradition of Tony Cliff, but this is just like the introductory section, I suppose, on Tony Cliff, like his original theses, but I'm not sure. I'm just reading these sections in on their own without reading like the whole chapter. I'm going to put them up as they're like standalone pieces. Okay. Cliff. Egil Gluckstein, who lived from 1917 to 2000, a Trotskyist from Palestine, writing under the pseudonym of Tony Cliff, carried on a, quote, state capitalist, end quote, opposition in the British section of the Fourth International from about 1947. After Tony Cliff had initially criticized both the theories of the degenerated worker state and bureaucratic collectivism in 1947, he published an extensive account of his own views in 1948 under the title The Nature of Stalinist Russia, a work which, in revised and expanded editions, was reprinted several times. Cliff was set thinking by the events in Eastern Europe after 1944. I missed a footnote. Gluckstein/Cliff was born in 1917 in Palestine. From 1938, he was a Trotskyist and he emigrated to Britain in 1946. In 1947, Cliff was extradited and settled in Ireland, but he visited Britain regularly because his family lived there and joined in the discussions of the British Trotskyists. In 1952, Tony Cliff returned to Britain, where he became the leader of the small Socialist Review Group within the Labour Party, out of which the International Socialist and still later the Socialist Workers' Party emerged, not to be confused with the U.S. American Party of the same name. This information is based on an interview with the author in London on the 9th of July, 1979. End footnote. So where was I? If, as some claimed, the buffer states were worker states, then, so, Cliff concluded, Stalin was the man who realized proletarian revolutions there. But, if that was so, then it would be possible to establish proletarian states without proletarian self-activity. Cliff saw himself faced with two mutually exclusive logical possibilities. Or either the East European glacis comprised real worker states, glacis being like a term that people generally use, especially, particularly I notice it in other writings, to describe just like Eastern Europe. Particularly, where I've seen it at least, is particularly describing Eastern Europe when it constituted the Eastern Bloc. So Cliff saw himself faced with two mutually exclusive logical possibilities. Either the East European glacis comprised real worker states, and then the emancipation of the working class could be accomplished by others, or else only the working class could emancipate itself, and then the theory of the degenerated worker state could not be sustained. His own choice in the dilemma was clear. Quote, when I came to the theory of state capitalism, I didn't come to the theory of state capitalism by a long analysis of the law of value in Russia, the economic statistics in Russia, nothing of the sort. I came to the theory of state capitalism by the simple statement that if the emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class, then you cannot have a worker state without the workers having power to dictate what happens in society. So I had to choose between what Trotsky said, the heart of Trotsky is the self-activity of the workers, or the form of property. I decided to push away the form of property as determining the question, end quote. Tony Cliff. Cliff returned to the standpoint defended by Trotsky before 1933, namely that it only made sense to talk of a worker state if indeed the working class exercised political power and possessed direct control over the means of production. As soon as this was no longer the case, one could also no longer say a worker state existed, whether one called that state, quote, degenerated, end quote, or not. In that sense, one could still apply the concept of a worker state to the period 1917 to 28, be it with a socially autonomized bureaucracy, but not to the period since then. The first 5-year plan constituted a revolutionary qualitative change. The bureaucracy began at that point to execute in high tempo the historic task of the bourgeoisie, the creation of a large proletariat and the accumulation of capital. Kragh characterized the state capitalism consolidated under Stalin as, quote, the extreme theoretical limit which capitalism can reach, end quote. Just as a worker state embodied the transitional phase to socialism after the proletarian revolution, Soviet state capitalism was the last transitional phase of capitalism prior to the socialist revolution. Schematically, one could represent this idea in the following way. I'm going to read this little chart here. It says transitional phase. Here's the schema. There would be the traditional capitalist phase, right, or stage, and then a state capitalist phase or stage, and then proletarian revolution, which would create a worker state, and then the worker state would create socialism. The transitional phase would be between, I can't really see if it's between, but you get the idea. Traditional capitalism, state capitalism, worker state, then socialism. And between capitalism and the worker state, there would be proletarian revolution. It's the best I can describe. I think it also says the transitional phase would be between state capitalism and the worker state. I think that's what this chart is saying, but I can't be certain. While the transition from state capitalism to worker state was necessarily violent in nature, since a bourgeois army could not be wrested from the ruling class in a gradual way, Kragh believed that the inverse transition, said to have occurred in the USSR around 1928, was also possible without violence. The only requirement here was that internal democracy in the army was gradually broken down and replaced by a command structure uncontrolled from below. What then were the characteristics of this state capitalism? Kragh, who showed he had studied the relevant contemporary literature relatively well, combined elements of various earlier Marxist contributions in a distinctive synthesis which, at first sight, appears very consistent. With footnote. See, for example, references to Lucien Leraut's Marxism and Democracy, and Burnham's Managerial Revolution, and Hilferding's Critique of State Capitalism. End footnote. With Hilferding, Kragh agreed that the price mechanism in the Soviet Union did not express autonomous economic activity, but only a, not entirely arbitrarily determined, transmission belt, with which the state apparatus regulated the production and division of labor of the whole society. With Dunayevskaya and James, he shared the belief that the individual enterprises in the USSR were not autonomous economic units, but just subordinate cogs in a greater whole. Footnote. For a brief period, Kragh maintained comradely relations with Dunayevskaya. Ray Chalanur reports that the two had agreed on a, quote, division of labor, end quote, in theorizing about the USSR. Quote, I had a letter from Raya Dunayevskaya saying she met Kragh in 1946 at the 4th Congress of the Fourth International. They agreed she would devote her time to study the philosophical implications and that Kragh would look at the economic issues, end quote. End footnote. Where was I? If one saw the Soviet Union in isolation, without taking into account the international context, then it would strikingly resemble, quote, one big factory, end quote, which is led from a central point. The capitalist character of this big state enterprise became visible if one included world relations in the analysis. Then it transpired that the Soviet Union as a nation was comparable to any individual capitalist enterprise which sought to survive within competitive relations. Kragh, however, did not leave the analysis at that. While James and Dunayevskaya had left the precise nature of the competition between the USSR and foreign rivals out of consideration, Kragh developed his own theory about the subject. Kragh's point of departure was the following observation, quote, hitherto, Russia's backwardness has ruled out any question of flooding foreign markets with Russian goods. On the other hand, Russian markets are kept from being flooded with foreign goods by the monopoly of foreign trade which only military might can smash, end quote. Kragh, 1948. This circumstance could, however, be taken to imply that the Soviet Union as a national capitalist enterprise did not compete with other foreign capitals. And if that was the case, would it then still make sense to talk about, quote, capital, end quote, at all? Kragh thought he could neutralize the obvious objection by postulating that international competition did not take place by means of commodities, but by means of use values in the form of armaments. This, quote, innovation, end quote, with regard to the Marxist law of value, which, after all, only involved competition by means of realized values, effective sale of commodities, was defended by Kragh in the following way, quote, value expresses the existence of competitive relations between independent producers. The results of Russia's standing in competition is expressed by the elevation of use values to an end, the end being victory in this competition. Use values, therefore, while being an end, still remain a means, end quote. The end. There's a footnote. Various authors claim that Kragh's theory strongly resembled the theory of bureaucratic collectivism because both assume that the law of value did not apply within the Soviet Union. Obviously, there are striking parallels between Kragh and Joseph Carter, especially, who had defined the USSR as a, quote, huge national trust, end quote. But this interpretation overlooks the most important reason why Kragh devised his own theory, namely because the theory of bureaucratic collectivism, in his opinion, could not explain economic growth in the USSR. Kragh called bureaucratic collectivism a theory which was, quote, only negative, end quote, and thus, quote, empty, abstract, and therefore arbitrary, end quote. End of footnote, the end.